Hello and welcome to Soteriology 101 live Google Hangout. I will be opening up the room shortly for those who would like to join in to the live discussion on YouTube. It's been broadcast on YouTube, obviously, and for those that want to join in the discussion that we're going to be having with regard to my discussion with Chris Date, who I consider a friend and a brother. And I think who did a great job in our broadcast with Justin Brierley on the Unbelievable broadcast. I think he did a good job as any could do in defending an indefensible position, in my estimation. Obviously, he doesn't think it's indefensible. He wouldn't be defending it if he did. But I think theistic determinism, is an indefensible position because ultimately you have to come to the realization the only way for you to be a determinist if God has determined for you to be a determinist, and the only way that you wouldn't be a determinist if God has determined for you not to be a determinist. And making the whole discussion and debate virtually irrational. I think William Lane Craig makes that argument pretty strongly in one of his articles that I've read and referenced before, is that ultimately if you're you don't affirm libertarian free will, but that instead you affirm that all things are determined, even our decision to accept or deny determinism is ultimately up to God, then it really debunks the concept and idea of rational discussion and deliberation, trying to ultimately talk somebody into coming to your side, because ultimately you're not going to convince them to come to your side unless obviously God has determined. So it's not through the convincing or through the arguments that you're ultimately won over. It's through ultimately God's determination. So God is determining what I'm saying, and God's determining what Chris is saying in this debate, making the whole discussion, I think, completely irrational. Obviously, they don't say it that way because they continue to have these discussions. By the way, I cannot see, for whatever reason, comments on YouTube. If you're able to make comments on YouTube, I've messed with it for a while here, and I've been able to see it before, but it says its restricted mode is on. And so I have no idea why I can't see those comments. That's why I'm going to open up the Google Hangout here in a little while, and you can find the link to the Google Hangout to sign into the Google Hangout once I post it there on the Facebook page. The Soteriology 101 Facebook page, or the Soteriology 101 group page, which is now called the Flowers Patch, as a continuation of an April Fool's joke, which is going to be a full April month joke, apparently. So you can find the link on either one of those two pages that if you want to join in and join in the discussion or ask questions or anything that you would like to do with regard to this discussion, we'll have that available. But what I've noticed is if I don't get out some of the arguments and things that I want to make sure we get covered before I open up the live chat, then sometimes we never get to them. So what I thought I would do first and foremost is to kind of go over a little bit of the aspects of the debate that I wanted to go over, where Chris and I discussed some of these issues. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play some of the recording from the broadcast I had on Unbelievable with Chris Date, and then just give you some of my comments. You're obviously restricted time-wise in a live kind of a debate, especially a debate like on a format like Unbelievable with Premier Radio, because they have, obviously a host with Justin who's asking questions. You've got commercial breaks, and so he's always talking about keeping your answers brief so that you have enough time to go through all the passages you're wanting to go through. And so there's so much more that Chris and I both could have said, and many of you know that because you've heard us discuss these things before. I think Jonathan Pritchett made a pretty funny joke when he talked about him being glad that the discussion this time was on the Unbelievable broadcast, because the last time Chris and I recorded it went so long it seemed like to him eternal conscious torment, which is of course a side joke to those who know Chris's view on annihilationism. So I thought that was pretty funny. Anyway, let me jump right in, and I'm going to be kind of just picking out little portions of the discussion to talk through, and let you guys give some feedback as well after I open up the room for discussion. So let's pick up in the discussion where Chris is giving some explanation as to his view of sovereignty. And
I guess
that's Justin, by the way.
What about that kind of moral dimension of this? I think that's sometimes the thing that propels people to change their mind on this, is they don't like what it might mean if God does essentially predetermine that some people will be saved and some people won't, or equally, all of the facets of evil and suffering that exist in the world, that God is somehow ultimately responsible for every bit of suffering that goes on. Does that moral dimension, has that ever kind of caused you to wonder in that sense?
I don't think so, and quite the contrary,
That's
I would
Chris.
say, and as I write about at the very, very beginning of my contribution to this book, I find the Calvinist God extremely beautiful, and far more beautiful, in fact, than the non-Calvinist God. And so I opened the book explaining that my wife and I have had a couple of miscarriages, and two of them, one before we were believers and one afterwards. And what really was different between the two occurrences, yes, being Christians was part of that. Having a Christian community to turn to for help and for comfort and support was part of it. But the biggest difference is that my wife and I were able to grieve, but trust in the goodness of God, because we knew that God had good purposes in the miscarriage that we believed that he had foreordained. And sure enough, we would find out years and years later that there were good purposes in that, and I won't give that away. I'll encourage people to check out the book. But the point I'm getting at is that for me, the options are either you believe God sort of takes this hands-off approach and lets human beings commit senseless acts of evil, and yes, he's able to work things out of those senseless acts of evil. He's able to work good out of them, but the acts in and of themselves are purposeless, pointless, senseless. They're just pure terrible evil. Whereas in my view, God doesn't let those things happen. He ordains them to happen because he has good purposes in them. And for me, that makes what my wife and I suffer, and friends and family suffer, both natural and moral evil, all the more tolerable, and we're able to have peace in the midst of it because we know that God has good purposes in mind. So I find the Calvinist God to be beautiful and compelling, not monstrous and terrible.
And this is encapsulated in this phrase that you've coined, well, not you've coined, but you use, meticulous divine providence. So do you want to just?
Okay, so the reason I wanted to play that section is because he obviously, from his own subjective viewpoint, he views his view of God as opposed to our view of God as more beautiful, more glorious, higher, if you will. And the reason I play that is because later in the broadcast, and I think Chris is well intending, but I'm just pointing out some, I think, inconsistencies, because later in the broadcast, he says this.
Author. As for this idea of greater or lesser sovereignty, I'm not going to pretend to be God and be able to determine which view of sovereignty is higher or lower. In fact, I don't think in Leighton's, in my entire history, I don't think I've ever tried to say that my view of sovereignty is higher than his or vice versa. So I'm just not going to comment on that.
Okay, so it just seemed a little bit backwards, because earlier he was saying he's more beautiful, which would be a higher view, that on our side, God's more hands off. And it's almost like what we've seen with James White and others. With all due respect, sometimes they paint this false dichotomy. It's either determinism. God maps everything out like an author writing a book, scripts it, which, by the way, he even uses that as one of his analogies in this debate, is that God has just authored this. It's just a script, that everything is happening according to the script of God. Or it's either that, or this God's this hands-off approach. He's wringing his hands. He's not sure what's going to happen, and everything that happens based on free creatures is just this purposeless evil. And again, this is just a false dichotomy, as if it's either full-on determinism or this hands-off, and God's just up there going, oh, man, I really wish I could do something about some of these things, or, man, I don't have any purpose in allowing for free will and all these issues. And that's kind of the false dilemma that's painted sometimes. And I just like to point out to those listening, and for those that are still kind of following these arguments, that the false dilemma or false dichotomy is when you paint two options as if they're the only two options, making your option seem a lot better than the straw man you've created over here for the other option, when really there's a lot better option besides the two that are being painted. And I think the better option is the view that we, of course, hold to, which God does have a purpose, as C.S. Lewis explains, in allowing for freedom of the will. But the reason that an evil act is so evil is that it's godless. It's a godless act. And so the purpose of an evil rapist is evil because it's godless, because he's not doing what God wants him to do. That's what makes it evil. And so to try to paint this world as if everything that happens is scripted by God for a purpose, or caused by God for a purpose, is not the biblical narrative, especially the fact that God Jesus teaches us to pray, God, may your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven, which seems like a superfluous prayer, as I mentioned in the debate, if God's will is always done perfectly and unchangeably here on earth as he wants it to. And there are many, obviously, examples of where the scriptures speak of things that are frustrations to God and things that he did not want or did not enter his mind or that he did not command, as we discussed in the original broadcast. And so I just wanted to point out that little, I think, inconsistency. Again, I like Chris. I think he's a great guy, but that was just one inconsistency where he does earlier paint his view as the higher view. And I guess, subjectively speaking, he can feel as if it gives him more comfort to think that God is the one who caused the death of his children in this situation with his spouse. And I've told him in other discussions, I don't like using an individual's own personal pain as a theological point. But I, in my experience, find that people are more comforted knowing that God redeems the evil, not that he causes the evil so as to redeem it. And the analogy, as childish as one may think it is, I think it's still a good analogy of the old Incredibles movie with Syndrome, the evil villain, the little kid who wants to be a superhero. And so he creates these robots that go and attack the world that he's actually controlling. And he has the little remote control on his wrist, if you remember the movie. And I've got 4 kids, so I get to watch these kinds of fun things multiple times. But he's controlling these robots and causing them to attack the city. And then, of course, he shows up as the superhero because he wants everybody to worship him and adore him as the superhero because he's jealous of all these superheroes. And so he goes in and he starts defeating these robots that he's himself is controlling. Now, everybody is praising him when they think he's just destroying these evil robots. But of course, once it's uncovered that he's the one who created these robots and he's the one who's meticulously controlling these robots, then obviously his plan is foiled, and he's seen as the evil villain that he actually is. And this is the problem with the Calvinistic worldview, is that ultimately you make God out to be the syndrome in the sky, so to speak, that he is creating the evil that he's redeeming. He is determining the very things that he is supposedly redeeming, thus making the redemption of the evil much less impressive, much less praiseworthy. It's like the old analogy of the fireman. Yeah, great fireman, but then you find out he's also the arsonist that set the fire. You go, oh, okay, well, the fireman just lost his hero status in our eyes because we found out he's the creator of, he is the direct cause of the very fire that he supposedly put out or he rescued us from, thus really diminishing the hero status of the superhero in the syndrome story or the fireman in the fireman analogy. And I think that's the fault line of the Calvinistic deterministic worldview, is that by ultimately putting back onto God what creatures do, i.e. evil intentions, evil hearts, evil pride, lust, as we discuss in this program, when you put that back onto God, you bring down God. You don't lift him up. You're exalting you're exalting man instead of God by doing that, in my estimation. So that's part of the discussion. Now, in the next section here, this is where we get into Joseph's brothers and the intention of evil. And before I play this section, because this is Genesis 50, and I think this is probably the bulk of our discussion, because I think it's probably the one that's focused on the most, but I think it becomes clear, and I think even a discussion that Chris and I had afterwards via Facebook Messenger clarified that I don't take the same position of the person he responds to in his book, and I think he assumed that I would, or he didn't understand my argument in such a way as to rebut me, but instead to rebut, I think, what he thought I was going to be arguing. And I've clarified that with him now, and I think he understands that now. But during the discussion, I think it'll become clear that he was not following my actual position, because I have no problem in saying, and as the scripture I think says, is that God did intend the evil event, the selling of Joseph into slavery, just as he intended the evil event of Jesus being crucified. And I attempted to explain that on the broadcast, but I think maybe Chris just misunderstood me and said, no, Leighton just thinks he's using the event. And I said, no, I think he actually intended the event. He didn't intend or the pride. He didn't determine the Joseph's brothers to have pride. That was my argument. He does not intend and or cause the criminals to be criminals or the brothers to be prideful or lustful. He doesn't determine that. Those things are not from God, but from the world. And it doesn't seem that Chris followed that line of argument within the discussion, and therefore it kind of led us off into a grammatical discussion, which there was no reason to even discuss grammar because there wasn't anything grammatically that I disagreed with Chris about. And so that's what I was trying to point out in the discussion. But look at this article I wrote just, I guess, a day after the debate. That way you can kind of see a little bit more of what I'm trying to make that a little larger so that you might be able to see it. Okay, so here, Genesis 50, I guess you can see that there, hopefully. All right, there we go. Okay. I write this, I said, I did want to develop one particular point that was raised in the discussion regarding the selling of Joseph by his brothers. This is a classical proof text out of Genesis 50 used by compatibilists, like Chris would be considered, to establish their deterministic worldview, which, by the way, compatibilism is deterministic. I don't think Chris attempts to say otherwise. He's fine with being called a theistic determinist. Those who understand this debate don't try to denounce that their view is a form of determinism, theistic determinism. Some people rebuke me for equating Calvinist with theistic determinists, but those are people who just don't understand the scholars from both worldviews. If you are a Calvinist who affirms libertarian free will, then stop calling yourself a Calvinist. Call yourself something else, because that's not what Calvinism is, and certainly stop accusing people like myself of not understanding Calvinism or theistic determinism, because clearly you just aren't aware of the best scholars from each worldview if you're still thinking that. So call yourself something else, come up with another name, or a modified version of Calvinism if you wish, but it's not historic Calvinism if you deny compatibilistic determinism. And so they will argue that if the brothers intended to sell the sale of Joseph an evil event, and God also intended that same event, then that proves God predetermined an evil event. And if God predetermined one evil event for which men are still culpable, then indeterminists like myself have no moral grounds to object to their claim that God predetermines all things while still holding mankind justly responsible for their actions. Now, there are a number of problems with this argument, some of which I did touch on in the debate on the Unbelievable broadcast, but I didn't have really time to fully develop it. So let's focus on two of those points here. One, proof that God intends an evil event to happen does not prove that God determines all evil events that happen. Let me say that again. Proof that God intends an evil event to happen, like the crucifixion or the sale of Joseph into slavery, just because he intends or even devises or works to ensure that that event happens, does not prove, catch us, does not prove that God determines all evil events that happen. Now, Chris concedes that point in our discussion, by the way. He does concede that just because we show that God does intend or work to devise one evil event, that therefore he doesn't necessarily prove that he devises or brings about every evil event. So he does concede that point, okay, which is good. He should. But here's the second point. Proof that God intends an evil event to happen does not prove that God determines the motive or desire of all the parties involved in that event. That's the main point I was trying to emphasize that I don't think Chris was understanding. And at least he didn't address it in the actual debate. So let me say that second point again, so to make sure you hear it and understand it. Proof that God intends an evil event to happen does not prove that God determines the motive or desire of all the parties involved in that event. So in other words, proof that God wanted for Joseph to be sold into slavery so as to end up with Potiphar, and then to eventually be second in command with Pharaoh so as to rescue them from the famine for redemptive purposes. Proof that that's what God intended does not prove that God determined for his brothers to have pride. You see that? And that's where the problem of determinism falls in, is because if God is determining all things that are brought to pass, then the pride of the brothers is brought to pass. That is something that he determined. So God, under Chris's view, doesn't just determine the event to happen. He also determines the motive or the desire of the parties. And this is why that I used the police officer analogy as a means to demonstrate how the police officers can bring about an evil event without being the causal determiner of the criminal's evil intentions to begin with. In other words, the police officers don't make them into criminals in order to bring about the sting operation. The officers use already evil people to bring about a particular evil event for a good purpose. And so Chris actually addresses these points in a rebuttal of Roger Olson, as seen recorded in his book. This again from Chris Date's book. He writes this: Olson suggests that these events, like Joseph being sold, are all exceptions to the rule, that even in such exception, God merely knows how to get people to freely do what he wants them to do. God may, Olson offers, quote, God may, and no doubt sometimes does, bring about some event by placing people in circumstances where he knows what they will do freely. And that means libertarianly freely, by the way, because this is Olson, okay? So God may, and no doubt sometimes does, bring about some events like the crucifixion, like the selling of Joseph, by placing people in circumstances where he knows what they will freely, libertarianly freely do, because he needs them to do that for his plan to be fulfilled. But the latter constitutes nothing more, according to Chris, than one plausible account of the mechanics of divine providence and foreordination. If God wills to bring about some event, knows infallibly under what conditions free creatures will bring it about, and presents them with such conditions, then he has chosen beforehand to sovereignly ensure that that event takes place by the hands of free creatures. This, Chris says, simply is divine foreordination. God is the primary cause and free agents are the secondary ones. So the sting analogy really fits well with this. If God wills to bring about some event, like the police officers will to bring about the sting operation, and they know, at least as well a police officer can know, under what conditions that criminals will act to bring about those crimes, and they put those conditions in place where they will act in that way, then the police officers have, in a sense, worked to bring about that event, but they're not guilty for their intentions to do so. So that was my point in that analogy. When Olson says, this is me writing again, when Olson says freely, he obviously means libertarian freedom, something Chris elsewhere denies. But in this instance, Chris seems to concede this is one plausible account of the mechanics of divine providence. In other words, he's conceding Olson's point here, it seems to me. Now, this pleases me because it demonstrates that Chris affirms that libertarian free will is plausible and does not require God being the determiner of men's prideful, evil intentions. In other words, God didn't need to be the determiner, the causal determination of lust or of pride of Joseph's brothers. Also, this explanation perfectly fits the police sting analogy that I offered in our discussion, which you guys have heard before, so I don't need to go over that again, I don't think. See, in a sting operation, the police know with some level of certainty that if drug dealers are put in the right circumstance, that they will sell drugs. Thus, the police work to ensure those conditions so that the criminals will freely choose to sell drugs at a pre-appointed time and location where they will be caught. The police are working to ensure this event will take place by the hands of willing, libertarianly free criminals. In other words, criminals that are not determined by the police to act the way they are acting self-caused actions. In other words, the criminals are not being caused to act the way they are by the police. They are simply being put into circumstances to act according to the kind of people that they are, and the kind of people they are by their own choosing are criminals. Okay, it's not the police making them criminals so as to bring about the sting operation. It's using their criminal intentions to bring about the sting operation. In the same way, God using prideful brothers to bring about the selling of Joseph doesn't mean that God caused the pride in Joseph's brothers. So let us apply the same standard to Genesis 50 account. If one wishes to bring about the sale of Joseph, and he knows with certainty under what conditions the brothers will freely act to sell him, and ensures a way to put them within those conditions, then based on concession above, I think Chris and I would agree that God is ensuring that events take place by the hands of the libertarianly free brothers. Chris admitted that this is, quote, simply divine foreordination. God is the primary cause, and free, libertarianly free agents are the secondary ones. And notice, libertarianly free will is still fully intact under Chris's concession. and God is never established as being the determiner of pride, which motivated the brothers to commit this crime. Clearly, Chris need not maintain his meticulous view of divine determinism, especially divine determinism of pride, in order to explain how God might bring about these types of events. Consider that Joseph's brothers' original intent was to kill Joseph, not merely sell him. Now, from where did that intention originate? According to the text, it was jealousy and pride. Well, where does pride find its origin? Is it God's decree? Well, obviously, that's the root of our disagreement. Where does the evil intention of pride come from? Well, we know from 1 John 2:16, which I make much of in the debate, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world. Yet determinism seems to say it comes directly from God's authorship, God's decree, that God is the originator of, or the beginning of, or the cause of, whatever verb you want to use. But the scripture seems to say that's not from the Father, but it is from creation. It is from what's been created, not from the Father directly. And so I think that's the main crux of our discussion. But with that said, let's listen into what Chris has to say about this.
Intended by Joseph's brothers. So what Joseph is saying here is that the very same evil intended by his brothers when they sold him into slavery is the very same evil that was intended by God. The only difference, Joseph says, is that God meant that evil for good. That is, his purposes in bringing that evil about through the agency of Joseph's brothers was good, unlike the purposes for which Joseph's brothers did it. Now, I don't think that believers in libertarian free will like Leighton can explain this text. Without fail, every single attempt I've seen, including my opponents in my book, fails to take account of the way the grammar is structured here by Joseph, the fact that God and Joseph's brothers are both the subject of the same verb and the same direct object. So that's what I'd be interested to hear how Leighton understands this text.
Yeah, Leighton, how do you deal with this one then?
Well, sure. I'd back up a little bit and look at the context of the text, because the original intent of the brothers was not to sell the brother into slavery. If you look through the narrative, their original intent was murderous. They wanted to kill him because of pride. They were jealous. Well, where does pride originate? Where does that come from? 1 John 2:16 says, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world. So whatever we conclude here, we cannot go against what Scripture teaches us and conclude that some eternal divine decree is the cause or the origin of these brothers' pride. We have to come to a better conclusion than to impugn, I think, again, unintentionally, I think Chris's view impugns the character of God in that way. And so what we would say, I'll give an analogy. For example, police officers create a sting operation where they know of notorious drug dealers in the area. They know their intention. They know that they're evil. And they don't cause, but they use the evil intention of criminals in order to bring about the selling of drugs at a particular time on Thursday at 2:00 in the warehouse, so as to catch all the drug dealers in one place in a sting operation. So the police officers meant that selling of drugs, an evil crime, for a good reason, while the criminals meant it for a bad reason. So the same crime, the same act is being meant by both the police officers and the criminals. One is being meant for an evil purpose, for selfish gain. The other is being meant for a good purpose. And in the same way, in this scenario, obviously God meant what the brothers did for a good purpose, for redemption. So God's not redeeming his own determinations here. He's redeeming the brothers' bad determinations. He's bringing a good from the bad. He's not causing the bad so as to just redeem his own determination.
Just before we come to you, Chris, just getting slight overload on your mic there, Leighton. Could you just back off it ever so slightly? It might just make it a little different.
And by the way, this is the unedited version. I had recorded on my computer, and that's why you hear Justin saying that. Well, you won't hear that in a live broadcast. So this is behind the scenes kind of thing.
For me. Thank you.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, all right. Chris,
I'll offer a similar
what's your view then?
analogy, and it fails for the same reasons that I think Leighton does, which is that it does at least one of two things. Either it changes the verb that is being used when God is the subject, or it's changing the meaning of the verb. So Leighton used a couple of different phrases. First, he said that God doesn't intend the evil act.
So that's wrong, actually. And this is what I was correcting Chris on earlier, is that I never said that God doesn't intend the evil act. What I argue is that, yes, he intended the action itself, the selling of Joseph's brothers, just like he intended the crucifixion of Jesus. Okay, he intended that act of evil. What he did not, quote unquote, devise, cause, determine is the pride by which motivated the brothers to do that evil act. just like the criminals in the criminal sting operation.
He uses the intention of the evil act that the criminals had. So he doesn't say he intended it. He says God used what was intended by the criminals. So he's changing the verb there.
So there's no verb change. So he just misunderstood, because we're not talking about God's intention of the act itself. We're talking about God's determination of the pride by which the evil act comes to pass.
But then he says, well, actually, he meant it in the sense that he allowed it to happen. But that changes what the verb means from what it means throughout the Old Testament when this verb is, when the direct object of the verb is ra'ah, meaning evil, injury, or wrong. In my book, I list something like a half dozen or more passages all throughout the Old Testament, including the two I read when I introduced this passage, where when the verb takes this direct object, it means to devise, to plan. So we have to account, regardless of all the philosophical speculations that I think that Leighton, understandably, but I think wrongly, tries to read into this passage. What we have here is a case where Joseph's brothers intended harm, and God intended that harm. We can't change what that verb means just because it doesn't fit our philosophical conclusions, our a priori conclusions that we're reading into this text, and we can't allow ourselves to say that God does something other than the intending, the devising, the planning that this verb communicates. So I remain convinced that, as far as I can tell, there's been no sensible explanation offered from Leighton that takes account of the grammar and the words that are being used in the text here.
What do you think of the grammar issue, Leighton?
Well, I just disagree. I mean, I do believe he meant it being the evil act. He did mean it, just like he meant for the son to be crucified. That's an evil act. God did mean it.
But did he devise or plan it?
Yes, that's the point. But we don't believe that God devises all evil intentions of every heart. He's using what they intended for evil for his good. So he meant for that evil act, just like the police officers meant for them to sell drugs. God meant for the brothers to sell Joseph into slavery. God meant for Judas and Pilate to crucify Jesus. But they did so in the way that the police officer analogy shows us, for good reasons. It doesn't mean, in other words, you don't have to conclude that the police officers are implicit with every single drug deal or causally bringing about every single drug deal in town simply on the basis of what God does in a particular situation, or what the police department does in a particular situation. And I think that's just a fallacy to say that because of what is true of the part must be true of the whole, because God it works within this particular scenario to ensure this particular event takes place for a good purpose, is somehow means God meticulously determines everybody's evil desires and thoughts.
Well, and I just think that we need to be careful not to claim that we're saying that the same verb applies to both parties, when what you actually mean is what you say, which is what they intended to do, God decided to use that intention. No, the same verb applies for both subjects. And as you've already acknowledged, the verb means devise or plan. That's what it uses all throughout the scriptures when it's combined with this direct object. So I've yet to see how even your analogy can apply and say that God devises this evil, he plans this evil, when actually what he means is use the intent of the people doing the evil. That's changing the meaning of the verb.
Well, we'll let the audience decide which of the two explanations are the best ones.
Yeah, we're going to have to move on.
Okay, and so did you notice that Chris did not answer the 1 John 2:16, that this is not from the Father but from the world? He doesn't answer that argument. He doesn't understand, I think, the point that I'm trying to say. I'm agreeing with his grammatical argument. I don't need to debunk something I agree with, because we both believe that he intended the action of the evil brothers. The act itself is intended by God, devised, if you will, brought to pass, worked to bring to pass, in the same way the police sting operation would be. But again, my point was to prove and to point back to the fact that proof that God intends an evil event to happen does not prove that God determines the motivation of that evil event. But on Chris's view of determinism, all things are brought to pass by God's causal decree. He's the one who scripted, he's the one who brought to pass the pride of Joseph's brothers. And that's what my point is that is not needed. You don't need to make God implicated in the cause of pride, especially given the fact that there's so many other passages that separate him from such evil motivations. And I just was reminded of this in a back and forth discussion on Facebook, where the question was brought up about Satan's original evil intention to rebel and what did that came from. And it reminded me of a broadcast I did back. It was in reply to Tony Miano is called The Sinful God of Tony Miano, which was in air quotes, scare quotes, because it was replying to him calling our view of God sinful. And so in the middle of that, I kind of unpack this John Piper broadcast where he talks about, speculates as to this question. And he pretty much punts the mystery as to saying we don't know why Satan determined to rebel, but somehow he still knows that God did it. In other words, he says that God's the one who ordained it, but we just don't know how he did it. And then he goes back and forth, and then he ends up contradicting himself by the end of the broadcast, pretty much talking about how God separated himself from Satan, therefore allowing for Satan to do this, which would be autonomous free will. I mean, he ends up giving speculation that actually proves our point versus his. And you can go back and listen to that program if you want to listen to it. Just look up the Sinful God of Tony Miano and under Soteriology 101, and you'll find it. It's before I started doing the YouTube broadcast, and so it's back in the day when it's just the podcast. And you can find it. I think it's on one of the other YouTube channels that used to rebroadcast my audio. If you want to find that, you can go back and listen to it. But for those that want to join in, I did add a link to join into the Google Hangouts there at the Facebook page underneath in the comment section of the Facebook page. And so if you have questions or comments or other things that you would like to join in, I've got in what the main points that I wanted to highlight in our discussion with Chris Date. I do want to, I'll continue to play through some of this while we wait for those that want to join in. I see there's a couple joining in now. And feel free as you join in, guys, to if you have a point you want to make or a question you want to ask, just to go ahead and unmute your mic and just ask away if you have a question or comment that you would like to do. I'm trying to look on here. Usually I can manage this at the same time. Sometimes it doesn't show up though. So there's broadcast settings. I see one. Okay. Okay, yeah, that's what I wanted to do there. So that mutes people's mics when there's 3 or more people in the room. And that helps a little bit with the disturbances that can come with too many people that join the group. So I think Jay is in. I welcome Jay to the discussion. Appreciate you joining me. And if you have questions, feel free to type those into the side chat or to unmute your mic and join in. Welcome Michael Faber to the call as well. And feel free, as I said, just to jump in as you feel led to do so.
And it's a similar issue that's raised in the next one that you wanted to select. I'm just giving you 3 passages each to lay out your case here.
Sure.
The next one is Acts chapter 4, verses 24 to 28. Chris, I don't know if you want to quickly read that to us and explain how you think that as well. Also, when it comes to Christ's own death at the hands of Herod, Pilate, the Gentiles, and the Jews, reinforces your case.
Yeah, I mean, I'll read part of it. So here in Acts chapter 4, verses 24 to 28, the church praises their sovereign Lord, as they call him, saying, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, were gathered to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. The text doesn't even seem to need any explication, but I do want to make a comment first, just to sort of preempt what might be Leighton's response. I anticipate this being the response of at least some people. Some critics are going to point out that the root word of the compound verb translated predestined here appears earlier in Acts 2:23, in which Peter says Jesus was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. Paul also uses the same compound verb in Romans 8:29 and 30, saying that those whom God foreknew, he also predestined, ... And so the hypothetical critic I'm talking about, and I don't know that this is the response Leighton's going to offer, we'll hear that in a moment, but this hypothetical critic is going to say that Acts 4:24 to 28, about where the church says God, the people were gathered to do whatever God had predestined to take place, the hypothetical critic is going to say that this implies God simply foreknew what Herod, Pilate, the Gentiles, and the Jews would do to Jesus, and he predetermined, in scare quotes, what they did in the sense that he let them do it. But as I explain on pages 38 and 39 of my book, foreknowledge here and elsewhere can't refer merely to advance cognitive awareness of individuals or what they're going to do, because God knows this about everybody. That passage in Romans 8 that I mentioned says, those whom he foreknew, he predestined. Well, God foreknows everyone in that sense. Rather, consistent with the way the Old Testament uses God's knowledge of people, Douglas Moo observes that other New Testament references to God's foreknowledge of persons, they don't mean know before in the sense of intellectual knowledge or cognition. They mean enter into relationship with before, or choose or determine before. So appealing to foreknowledge here just isn't going to work. What we have here is the church saying that the people were gathered to do everything that God's hand and plan had predestined to take place. And this is the worst crime in history, the worst sin in history, the murder of the sinless Messiah. So I'm interested to hear what Leighton says.
All right, and those that already listened to the program know what I say to that. But Michael, why don't you chime in? You said you wanted to give commentary on the Acts 4 passage. So unmute your mic and go ahead, my friend.
Okay. Jesus kind of gives us a foreshadowing of this as he's talking about talking to the Jews about how they crucified the prophets. They killed the prophets from Abel to Zechariah. He gives us a clue in the vineyard workers, the evil vineyard workers, how they're going to be thrown out when they kill the son. And it seems like you said before, he's creating this false dichotomy between either God determines everything or God just kind of foreknows and sort of watches things happen. Whereas what we see in Jesus' ministry is he's constantly kind of poking the bear, and through his actions and through his ministry, through being a prophet, is actually bringing about his own death, not through determinism, but through really, like you use the analogy of the police officer, getting them to fit into, or him fitting into the role where they are eventually going to kill him. And I think Jesus' ministry, the way that he expresses sort of and interacts with the Jews, kind of gives us some clues as to how this predestination occurs. It's something he brings about, not something that's predetermines all events that are going to happen. So
Right.
That was my point.
Yeah, and actually in the discussion, I don't know how many of you actually listened to the discussion yet, because I know it's just released today, but I get into that a little bit in the discussion, because with Mark chapter 4 especially, we see that Jesus uses parabolic language and even some provocative language to provoke the Pharisees of the day, calling them brood of vipers at times, whitewashed tombs at times, at times speaking to them in parabolic language so that they are ever seeing but not perceiving, using harsh analogies and stories such as eat my flesh and drink my blood. And then when they all walk away, he doesn't say, wait, time out, guys. Wait, don't leave. As in John 6, don't leave, guys, don't leave. Come back. Let me explain to what I mean about eating my flesh. I don't mean literally taking a bite of my flesh. Like a cannibal, this is the figurative language that I'm using. He doesn't do that. He's clearly, I think, in my estimation, he's clearly using provocative language to continue to provoke already criminal hearts, already self-deceived, selfish, blinded people, ever seeing but not perceiving type of individuals because of their blind, hardened self-righteousness. They're the new old wineskins that can't take the new wine because of the way their heart has become over a course of time, not how it was ontologically from birth due to some inherited nature from Adam, but because of their consistent rebellion against the voice of God. They have grown hardened and callous to the point that they cannot see, hear, and understand, and God is using them in their calloused, rebellious, criminal-like condition, and telling his own apostles things like in Mark 9:9, don't tell anybody who I am yet. It's not right time. And we see this about 4 or 5 other places throughout the Scripture where he says, don't talk about this yet. It's not the right time. Where he's clearly hiding his identity as the Messiah, so as to keep them in their already rebellious condition. And so this would be an example of what I think you were talking about, God using certain means to manipulate and to bring about a purpose through already criminal people, like the Jews would have been of that day, already self-righteous, hardened, hell-bound individuals who are already on their way to hell. Now, does that mean, therefore, God doesn't want them to be saved? Well, no, any more so than a police officer, at least a good police officer, wouldn't want a criminal to continue to be a criminal. He would want the criminal to repent and to become a good citizen. But that's not what he's obviously wanting to do in that particular event. He's wanting to bring about a particular event for a purpose. But Jay, go ahead, brother.
Well, I was just going to say, I was looking at the verse here where it says they've done whatever your purpose predestined to occur. It doesn't say that they did only what you predestined to occur. That they could have done many things that they were already in their evil hearts to do.
Right.
But they did. There were certain things God predestined to occur using even evil people, and those things did happen.
Yep. And this is when I like to kind of use Calvinists' own words against them, so to speak, by pointing out the fact that whenever they refer to all without exception versus all without distinction, when it comes to Ephesians 11, when it says, in him we were chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will, does all things there mean all things without exception or all things without distinction? Because it seems to me to be a parallel verse of Romans 8:28, when he says that God works things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. This seems to be a parallel to that, of those who are in Christ. God works out. He brings about good. He redeems for those who are in Christ, those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And so to try to make those all without exception, that every single thought, action, and deed that Judas did throughout his life was actually deterministically, causally brought to pass by God, simply because in Acts 4 it says that God's purpose was fulfilled through the act of Judas, certainly is a non sequitur and does not follow that God's deterministically bringing about every single thought, action, and deed of Judas just simply because he used Judas in his criminal behavior to bring about a particular event for the redemption of humanity. I see Chris is in the chat, Chris Harris there, but I also know Chris also has children at home sometimes, and so sometimes he keeps his mic muted when he can't talk. But Chris, feel free to jump in as you will.
Sure, yeah, I can talk. I'm actually out of the house right now, so it's not so bad.
I know the feeling. Sometimes when all my kids are actually out of the house right now, and so yeah, lucky dog, Michael says, yeah, all my kids are out of the house right now. Now I've got 2 dogs in the house, so they may burst out and barking at any moment. Who knows? But yeah, go ahead, my friend.
I just had something to run by you because it's something I was thinking about earlier. And actually, I tagged you in a post on Facebook in our discussion we were having, and that is, I've thought more about your police sting operation analogy. And the more I think about it, the more it seems to me to just be a form of compatibilism. Of course, we would have to nuance a little bit of it. I think the biggest problem I have with it is positing any type of manipulation there. Yeah, I just think that analogy works perfectly fine within compatibilism.
Curiosity, what's your problem with manipulating a criminal?
Well, because the basis of moral responsibility would be, as I think we both would agree, is that the Bible says that man makes choices he is both blameworthy or praiseworthy for. And in order for man to be responsible for those choices need to be free, uncoerced, and unmanipulated.
Okay, which you feel that under divine determinism they meet that qualification?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, but under my view of God manipulating already criminal minds, it doesn't meet that qualification.
Yeah, I think that would not obtain moral responsibility in that situation.
Why?
Well, because they're being manipulated to do something they otherwise wouldn't do.
So you're one of those people who object to police officers using sting operations?
No, I think that's fine. We're not God, right? I don't have a problem with.
They're being immoral. Are you saying police officers are being immoral by manipulating criminals?
No.
Okay, so why do you think God would be immoral by manipulating hardened sinners?
Okay, it's a good question. Maybe it's the level of manipulation that we should talk about there.
Right, and the level of manipulation on my side seems a lot more reasonable than God causally determining their pride.
Right. Well, and I think in when you see it, well, I didn't put the analogy in there, but John Feinberg uses an analogy for compatibilism in specific. I came to his essay via Stephen Wellum, who suggested an essay that Feinberg wrote as far as bringing out the differences between hard determinism and compatibilism, or soft determinism. And Feinberg uses an analogy of a school teacher who wants an unruly student to get to leave his classroom, even though this unruly student doesn't want to leave, right? So this would be something that if the teacher were to use some type of force, or that would go against that person's will, that wouldn't end up being a free will choice of the student to leave. Where in the end, he makes the case that it could be that the professor would tell the student, hey, there are people outside who are giving away money to students, and by that, the student would realize that it's in his best interest to leave the classroom, and leaves completely and utterly of his own free will. And that's an analogy used actually to support compatibilism.
Okay, so I mean, it sounds like a pretty similar to the police sting operation.
Yes.
Yeah. So it sounds like the problem, though, it seems like with the deterministic worldview, is that under compatibilistic determinism, the reason that the unruly student is unruly is because God determined for him to be unruly and to begin with. Is that not accurate?
I don't think that's utterly accurate, right? Because I was listening to you earlier. You were explaining Acts 4 when you guys were talking about it, and everything you said works fine under compatibilism, right? We like even when Jesus is using language in order to provoke the Jews, in order to bring about his crucifixion, that's fine. That would be the eternal decree being worked out in time. Even the actions that Jesus is saying, and we're not saying that the people that he was provoking were unable to turn at any point, right? But they were being used in order to accomplish the purpose of the crucifixion. I mean, that just simply is good compatibilism.
Okay, so let me back up for just to make sure we're on the same page. Are you in agreement with Chris's position of theistic determinism with regard to the pride of the brothers even being as a result of God's deterministic decree?
Yes, but that pride, I mean, if you just say it that way, then you're like, well, the guy's just making robots, right? He's just programming a person to do a certain thing, and there can be no obtaining of free will whatsoever. And that's not the case. Even though these actions are determined, right? Even though they're determined, people still make the free choices in order to put themselves in those decisions. So that
so back up just for a second, because to me, I just heard A equals not A. I just heard they're determined that they're free, and to me that's A equals not A, because free and determined are antonyms, not synonyms. And so when you use that kind of vernacular, I have to back up and say, okay, what do you mean by free, and what do you mean by determined?
Free is a choice made that is uncoerced or unmanipulated. So the determined choice is just that God determined that choice would be made, right? So God would freely choose that man chooses to do something freely and not under compulsion.
Okay, well, that sounds like Tozer's quote that we use oftentimes, that God's eternal decree was not that he would make the choice for us, but that we'd be free to make our own choices. But under compatibilistic determinism, the reason that anybody makes a choice is because it is their greatest desire within the given circumstances, both of which are ultimately God's control. In other words, God controls not only the nature, but also the circumstances in which that nature is interacting, so that a person is only going to be choosing according to what God has decreed for them to choose, right?
Right, but they choose that freely. It's still their desires. Their desires
are. So you mean by freely compatibilistic freedom, which means they're choosing according to desires that are ultimately determined by God?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. There are different causations, right? So there's different determinations. God is a determiner, but so is man. Man determines his own choices as well.
Okay, so in what real sense is man's determination to reject the things of God his? Because if you're born as Calvinism explains it, as a God hater, or one who opposes the revelation of God, opposes his appeals to be reconciled through the gospel, automatically. In other words, just ontologically, that's your reality from birth, is that you are opposed to anything that God wants of you, or expresses outwardly that he wants of you, at least. How is that not equal to God determining it or causing it directly?
Yeah, well, we're born in a sinful state. I don't think that God just the God creates so that we're born in some ontological unable position to use our reasoning faculties, right? So man being that he is, because as the doctrine of total depravity would say, that he is touched in every respect with sin, that him being that way, that it's not that he can't choose between A or B, or that if we're going to say that a good choice is we'll call it A and a bad choice would be B. It's not as though he's not presented with those two options, and both of those options aren't available, because they are. It's just that because of who he is, he will always choose the bad option. The reasoning faculties are still there.
Is that a factor within his control, or is that a factor beyond his control due to the way he's born?
It's a factor that is within our control. We use our reasoning faculties.
So you don't need to be regenerated in order to believe.
Yeah. You need to be your nature needs to be changed.
You have no control over the condition which you're born, and you also have no control over being reborn under Calvin. Right. So you're born in a disabled condition due to the fall of Adam. You inherited the fall of Adam. The condition of that fall is that you'll be a God hater unless God changes your nature to make you a God lover. And therefore, those are two factors beyond your control. You have no control over how you're born, and you have no control over whether you're born again, i.e. regenerated. So how is that not a factor beyond your control?
Well, everyone's born with, I mean, I guess if we're gonna, I don't know if we're gonna posit Platonic metaphysic or Aristotelian. I don't know where you fall on that, but I think everyone's born with the possibility of good and evil within them. It's just that we're always moved to evil prior to God moving on us.
Why? God's decree, or there's an accident, Mother Nature? Why are we always going to reject God's appeals to be reconciled?
Well, because Adam sinned and the world fell.
And we had no control over that. We individually had no control over that.
You had no control over Adam, and neither did I. So yeah, right. I mean that's.
So that's what I meant by the ontological reality we're born with. We're born with is incapacity to do anything except reject God's appeals to be reconciled, and yet we're held accountable for that which are factors beyond our control.
But I don't think that gets to the point of what accountability or more responsibility or what is necessary for that. As I explained, man is still born with and man is still born with the faculties, the reasoning faculties, in order to come to a free decision, right? He has the free will, genuine free will. Compatibilism posits such that his reasoning faculties have not been destroyed by the fall. Right? It's just that he always will choose wrong.
Okay. Michael, you raised your hand in the side chat, so feel free to jump in there, buddy.
Yeah, I was just going to say, but our reasoning faculties aren't what determine our choices. We can sit here and reason and think whatever we want, but in Calvinism, our strongest desire determines our choices, and our strongest desires are determined by our nature, not by our reasoning faculties or our whatever faculties we might have. And so these other faculties are nice, but they don't have any input into the choice. And I think they can't. Either the strongest desire determines the decision, or our reasoning determines the decision, but it's not both.
Well, I mean, you have a Calvinist sitting in front of you. I don't know why you would tell me what I believe.
Well, okay, but Chris, I think he's right. Ultimately, it doesn't. Two people can be reasoning, okay, but the ultimate factor that's going to cause one of them to believe and the other one's not is they're not the reasoning. It's whether God has chosen them and regenerates them or not. So it's ultimately what God does, not the reasoning capabilities. And so I think Michael's exactly right. You're ultimately saying that a person has the capacity to reason, but then you're also confessing with your own confessions that a person can only reason one way, absent some irresistible work of God.
Sure, but I don't see where that gets at the problem of not obtaining more responsibility on theistic determinism within a compatibilistic framework.
Okay, go ahead, Michael. I jumped in there, but I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're fine. The problem is that, well, you agree that the strongest desire determines our choice. I think you said that. And I'm also pretty sure that our nature determines our strongest desire. I believe that's correct as well. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then our nature comes from either from God or from our parents, but then we can trace desires in nature back to God. And so we have this deterministic chain that goes back to God that says nature's determine desires, desires affect nature, desires determine choices. And so if our desires are determining our rationale, our desires are determining our emotions, so if our desire is determining everything, the ultimate controlling factor is our nature, which determines our desires, and our nature ultimately comes from God. Excuse me, I have to cough. And so to say, well, we're rational creatures and we can still think about these things, it's still our desire that is the controlling factor. The strongest desire is what the controlling factor is in making our decisions. In having that strongest desire determined by our nature, we don't have free will because there's only one thing that we can do, and that's what our nature determines our strongest desire to be. So
Well,
there's no free will in that, because there's a deterministic chain leading back to God through natures and desires.
I don't think you actually dealt with the chain that we deal with, because I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm one who posits federal headship. So if we want to trace our nature back, we trace it back to Adam in the garden. Now, if we want to argue about whether or not Adam had libertarian free will according to your definition or whatever, it's going to fall back into some lapsarian issue that I'm not even really fond of having that conversation. So I don't go to pre-fall speculation on anthropology, because that's what it is. We just don't have the information of pre-fall anthropology. What we do have, if we're talking anthropology, which we are, we have a ton of post-fall anthropology. So that's where I'm dealing from, and I'm offering a system in which man is genuinely free and theistic determinism obtains. So I mean, if we want to, I don't want to delve into speculation on lapsarian issues or even pre-fall anthropology.
That's fine. But my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, a strongest desire determines our choice. Is that correct?
Yes, which is our strongest desire comes from what we reason as what we want, right? So when we see a choice of A or B, it's going to be something that is going to that we're going to go through a process. We're going to think about it, and we're going to choose it. It's not as though we believe something at the snap of a finger.
Okay, so then why does the mind always choose the evil?
Because of Romans 5, that sin entered the world, right? So I push everything back to, according to federal headship and the depravity of man, back to Adam's fall. And that's why
that's true. But
right. But if we go back past that, then we're into
speculation.
speculation.
Let me jump in on this point, though, real quick. Who, if not God, decides what the punishment for Adam's sin was? In other words, if one of my kids do something they're not supposed to do, I decide whether I beat them to a bloody pulp, which would be obviously illegal, or if I ground them to the room, which would be reasonable as a punishment, right? And so if a police officer came to my house after I beat my child, which of course I would never do, but if I beat my child in an unreasonable way, and I said, hey, well, that's just the natural result of what happens whenever you disobey in my house. It's just the way that it is. That's obviously not going to work as an appeal. You'd have to say, okay, no, wait, you determined the result of your child's misdeed. You determined what would happen to them. And so you seem to be trying to escape from, or maybe trying to distance God in some way from this quote unquote natural thing that just happened because of the fall. When I think on your view, you have to admit that the reason that Adam and Eve sinned in the first place was according to his decree, and the reason that the progeny or the children of Adam from that point forward would be incapable of responding positively to even God's appeals to be reconciled from that fall was because God decreed it. And so I don't think your view can escape the fact that God is the one who chooses, ordains, causes, whatever you want to use there, the very thing that you seem to be trying to distance him from by calling it natural, or just the natural result of what happens in the federal headship view.
Sure. Well, what I'm saying in that, Leighton, is that I don't take a dogmatic position and when it comes to the lapsarian issue. Right. So that's the order of the decrees of God. I'm not sure if the decree of election came prior to the decree for the fall, or vice versa, or whatever. But what I do affirm is that Adam had actual eschatological benefits available to him if he had obtained what he was supposed to. Right? He didn't. So like I said, I really don't want to talk too much about pre-fall anthropology just because we don't have any information on it. We got a couple of chapters, that's it, and not much really there about it. We have a lot of commands from God. We do have God telling Adam that if you do this, in that day you will die. Right? We do have commands. We have the dominion command to go out and have dominion over the earth and to be fruitful and multiply. But we just don't have a lot of pre-fall anthropology. So to try to set up a position based strictly on that is I don't think it's a good position. So I try to base my understanding on post-fall anthropology, what man is after the fall, and so that's where I started.
Right. Well, and even that, I think it gives us indication in Genesis, at least, that that Adam and Eve would have now the knowledge of both good and evil after the fall. And we see from the story of Cain and Abel that that God obviously treats them as if they have the freedom to bring the right sacrifice or not bring the right sacrifice, and are held responsible for that. So there's no indication, at least there in Genesis, or I would argue throughout the rest of the scriptures, that somehow Adam and Eve lost the liberty of the will to respond willingly to God's appeals. Now, obviously, I do think there's some results from the fall, i.e., under the curse of sin, a need for justification, a need for reconciliation, all of the things that we would, I think, agree upon. What I don't see ever established is this moral incapacity to respond positively to God's appeals to be reconciled from the fall because they're fallen. That just, it seems so much just theological baggage added to the text that's just never established in the pages of Scripture, at least as far as I can tell, or at least God hasn't determined for me to accept it yet. Maybe He will in the future, but He hasn't yet.
Maybe He will, and maybe He'll determine me to change my view in the future, right? I mean, that can work both ways. But speaking of like Adam and Eve knew the difference between good and evil after the fall. I mean, I would say they knew the difference between good and evil prior to the fall, or else how would they know that God's commands were right? So I mean, we really don't know, and theologians would kind of differ and debate about this. What exactly the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was? Apparently, we can't say that was something that gave them the to where they could know the difference of good and evil. Because, like I said before, prior to that, how would they know any of the commands that God had given them were right and wrong? How would they know it would have been wrong to eat from the tree? So it's some strange things there. That's why I don't like going back there to try to build some type of dogmatic doctrine. I would rather deal with what we have a lot of scripture on.
All right, Jay, go ahead, brother.
Well, one thing we do have, and when I began to look at the issue, I was willing to look at it both ways, but I was really struck by the fact that we had the fall, and one of the things that happens almost immediately after is Cain and Abel. And God does the remarkable thing of coming and personally visiting Cain and asking him, "What are you doing? Sin lies at the door, and you are to have dominion over it." It's just a startling thing to say. And putting that in the very beginning of the story of the human race, right after the fall, is remarkable just in itself.
Right, which establishes, I would say it establishes compatibilism, because the categorical ability of Cain to be able actually to subdue the sin that's at the door isn't necessary in order for that to be a truth statement that you need to master it, right? Because that is true, that sin is at the door of all of us, and we ought to master it. And so I don't see where that proves either way in the whole debate here. We would agree it proves that man makes choices that he's responsible for.
True, but why would God come and even visit him if he's unable to respond?
Well, I would say because Scripture was written for God's people, right? So when we go back and read that, we say, hey, sin is at the door. We need to master it. So it's all about teaching later on. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the actual narrative at that point, other than saying that you need to control your sin. That stands true no matter who you are.
Was Cain regenerated?
No, I don't believe so.
I doubt it as well.
Again, we just don't have the information, so
don't.
It's all speculation.
But what we do have is something that looks a lot like provisionalism. God coming and talking to someone and acting like he expects him to respond and talking like he can.
Calvinism posits that, right? I think there's an equivocation. I mean, we could get into something here, but anyway, there's an equivocation on the word can, and Calvinism offers the it can satisfy the principle of alternate possibility. So there is a sense in a way that a Calvinist can say that, yeah, man, a person can or could have did otherwise.
Well, and that's why I continue to try to nuance these words and critiques, because it always seems as if no matter what critique you bring, there's some philosophical nuance that tries to avoid the charge. And I don't think that you can avoid the charge that that those who are not regenerate, the natural born son and daughter of Adam, according to the decree of God from the fall, in other words, God decided what would happen as a punishment for the fall, that they would become morally incapable of replying positively to God's appeal. So in the Cain and Abel story, apparently Abel was able. Abel was given some kind of moral ability to bring a good sacrifice, whereas Cain somehow was withheld that moral capacity. Nothing in the text indicates this. The only thing that's indicated in the text is that God expected Cain to bring the same kind of sacrifice that he did Abel. There's nothing in the narrative or in the story or any didactic text that I can find that suggests that Abel was granted some kind of moral capacity or a factor within his control. That's the wording I try to use, because that's ultimately where it gets down to, is it a factor within their control? And if they're born in a condition where they can only reject God's appeals, as Calvinism posits, unless God regenerates them, i.e. gives them a new nature to make them want to do otherwise, which again is a factor beyond their control, then I don't think you can escape whatever philosophical nuance you'd like to add to that. I don't think you can escape the fact that you're ultimately either saved or condemned for factors that are beyond your control.
Sure. Well, I would just say, like in the instance of Cain and Abel, again, we're not told a lot about that situation, but I think one of the a basic principle of biblical hermeneutics would be that you can take earlier texts which may have implicitly say something, or something may not even be there at all about it, and then later in the text something could be drawn out explicitly or done through biblical theology or systematic theology, which is able to be applied back to that text. So we don't necessarily need for compatibilism to come out in the story of Cain and Abel in order to read it back into it, if we find it the case throughout the rest of Scripture, which I would say that it is dependent upon the totality of the biblical data.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Jump in there, Michael.
I was just going to point out, and actually I have this issue with Molinus as well, is that the principle of alternative possibilities is fine as long as Leighton has been saying, that the individual that's making the choice is the one that's in control of whether the alternate possibility occurs or not. And this actually occurs in Molinism as well, where God actualizes particular decisions. And so he's the one that's actually creating the alternative possibility. And you're doing the same thing here, that, well, there was an alternative possibility, but what has to be different for that possibility to occur? Well, in Calvinism, God has to basically give you, your nature has to be different in order for you to have another outcome other than what's chosen. And that's the alternate possibility has to rely on the individual. It has to be within their control. And I don't think you've established that the individual is in control of whether they make a choice to believe God or to reject God.
Sure, that would depend on how you define the level of control that's necessary, and it would also depend on whether or not, and I believe you're equivocating there with the PAP, that the ability necessary there is a categorical one. That's not actually the case, and we would posit there are a couple of different ways. I think some Calvinists or some compatibilists would posit a conditional ability, whereas, i.e., that the person would remain responsible and he could do otherwise had he wanted to, right? So if the person had wanted to do otherwise, if he had desired that, then he could have. And that's a conditional ability, not necessarily a categorical one. Or other compatibilists might posit a reasonable type understanding of ability there to obtain the principle of alternate possibilities. And that would be that if it is reasonable to expect a person to do something in a certain situation, or if it's reasonable to expect them not to do it, then that too is compatible under theistic determinism.
Allow me to push back on that with an analogy to, I think, express the absurdity of that within the compatibilistic framework, Chris. And again, suppositional arguments are often like this, but they're purely suppositional. If a mad scientist put a node in your brain while you were sleeping without your knowledge, that causes you to desire what he wants you to do. In other words, he's ultimately can fire the neutron in your brain to make you desire to push the next person you see off of a bridge. And you have ultimately no control over that desire and thus the action of that desire. Then I think if any jury of your peers found out that the scientists did this, they would not hold you accountable for your action because they would recognize what the scientists did causing you to desire that thing. So to say that, well, you're acting according to your desire, and if you had desire otherwise, so in other words, if the defense for the scientist got up and said, hey, well, if Chris could have desired to do if he had desired to do otherwise, he wouldn't have pushed the people off the bridge. And therefore that's your plead for true guilt, is that, oh, we should only hold Chris accountable, not the scientist, because after all, the principle of compatibilistic alternatives is, well, if Chris had desired to do otherwise, let's just ignore the fact that he's being controlled by the scientist as to what he desires. Let's just focus on the fact that if he had desired to do otherwise, then he could have refrained from pushing the person off the bridge. Again, it just falls apart on itself to talk about being able to do other than what you desire when the desires are ultimately controlled by someone other than yourself.
Sure, that's a fine objection there, but the problem with that is it's been answered. I say this, but I don't know. I don't remember it exactly. I mean, I'm in my vehicle driving around. I just know it has been answered, and I know one of the things that would be saying that in order to bring that objection, right, of a mad scientist putting something in my brain in order for me to desire something, or it'd be similar to like that would also be similar to someone slipping a drug in someone's drink that makes them desire X. So we would agree with you that those things would not obtain moral responsibility, right? And so the level of control there,
even if it was God using a drug.
Well, and then I was getting to the point. I was getting to my point anyway. I don't know that I can fully satisfy this, but one of the points would be that you would have to show the similarity between a person within theistic determinism and the person that is manipulated by the scientist. Some similarity that also includes their not being responsible. I don't think that the similarity is going to be found.
The parallel, if it's not obvious, is that you are born under the federal headship of Adam with the node in your brain to hate God's appeals to be reconciled and to reject them. That's the node in your brain. If that's not a parallel of the mad scientist, I don't know what is. But if you're born with the node in your brain to hate the gospel, and you cannot, it's a factor beyond your control unless God does some supernatural act to take out the node and make you love him again, then I don't know how that's not a parallel example. What would be a better parallel example?
Right, and I understand that you see that as a logical implication of theistic determinism, but that's just not the way philosophical arguments work. It's basically an assertion. I know you're saying that this is a good example and this will work this way, but I think it's an assertion that needs some other evidence in order to back it up. Like I said, you have to show similarities that would take away more responsibility, according to your analogy, and that of a person within a theistic determinism world. And I just don't think they make the case, and I can't fully answer that, Leighton. I'm not around my notes. I'm not in the truck, and I'm not really a philosopher. I have read a lot on it lately, but I don't remember everything. And it has been probably 3 months since I read that book.
I know you've referenced Ben Young's work, and I've actually messaged him and offered to have a discussion, and he hasn't replied in a desire to do that. I mean, he's talked about being real busy, and so that may not ever come to fruition, and maybe it will one day. But it seems to me, I've read his book a couple of times, actually, at least portions of it twice. I've read it all once, but I've read portions of it several times.
Well, he speaks specifically of that example in the book.
No, he does, but it seems to be somewhat special pleading and maybe a little bit of ad hoc on some of his points, because he seems to agree that if a person's a quadriplegic, for example, you wouldn't hold him responsible for standing or walking or doing something a quadriplegic can't do. But it seems to me that because it's a factor, and the whole reason for that is because it's a factor beyond the agent's control. That we can't obviously hold a quadriplegic responsible for not standing up on his own power, because clearly he's not able to do that. But
you realize that's an argument used against your equivocation on a categorical ability, though, right?
Right. Well, no, and that's the problem, is that they're missing the point. The point is it's a factor beyond the control. So whether it's the color of somebody's eyes, whether it's the color of their skin, whether it's their physical capabilities, whether it's a mental deficiency from birth, those are all the reason we would never justify racism or holding mentally handicapped people accountable for their mental disabilities or physical disabilities with a quadriplegic. The reason that that's intuitively known to be a wrong thing to do is because it's a factor beyond the agent's control. But yet when we switch over to a spiritual inability, then all of a sudden that principle just disappears ad hoc, just indiscriminately. We just say, oh, well, that principle doesn't apply anymore. Well, on what basis? And if that's true, then if God did want to just save all blue-eyed people and condemn all the rest, who are we to say God can't do that? Who are we to say that that's unjust if God just ad hoc decides, hey, blue-eyed people are my elect and all the rest are not? That's just, I'm God and I can save who I want to save. And if you come out blue-eyed, then you're in. If you don't, sorry, tough luck. Why is that any better or worse than a spiritual capacity that's beyond their control? You have no more control over whether you're a reprobate or whether you have blue eyes or whether you're quadriplegic or whether you have a mental deficiency. All of those are factors beyond your control. So what makes it blameworthy to be a reprobate under Calvinism?
Right. Well, but with all due respect, the example of the quadriplegic or the man with no arms situation that's an example used to show that categorical ability is not what's needed. So like in the situation, he would say that if you had a person with no arms and it was a moral responsibility of him to be able to hug someone, then we wouldn't hold him responsible for not being able to hug someone because he doesn't have arms.
Why can't God just hold him responsible for not hugging?
Well, and he does, and this is where the conditional ability comes in. Right, because why he's held responsible for this moral choice that he has to make on whether or not to hug someone is because it comes down to whether or not he desires to. Right, so instead of having the categorical ability to hug, and this is what establishes moral responsibility, it's the desire from the heart is what establishes the responsibility. So even though he couldn't actually categorically hug someone, he can desire to hug someone and therefore meet the requirement of the moral responsible act.
Well, again, if the desire is no more within the control of the agent than his armlessness, then I'm not sure why the factor is a difference with a distinction. Because if he's no more controlling his desire, as with a node in your head type of analogy, then the basis of his being blameworthy for not hugging is exactly the same as him being armless, as it is his desire. Both of those things are controlled not by himself, but by factors beyond his control.
Right, but I think you're taking the analogy to a place where is not intended to go. It's specifically intended to point out an equivocation on ability, on just the term ability. What ability is necessary to meet the requirements for moral responsibility? Whereas you would claim that the ability needed is a categorical one.
It has to be based upon a factor within the agent's control. That would be a good moral reason for blameworthiness.
Well, it would be, yeah, but that would be.
Is that not sensible?
No, but I mean, you're just equivocating. So you're just saying that the only ability necessary.
With all due respect, you can't just answer every single argument I say by calling it equivocation.
I need to be able to explain what I mean by that.
I'm using an analogy to compare a physical inability with a moral inability. And you can't just ad hoc say that because something is a factor beyond your control physically and somehow you're not responsible for it. But ad hoc just special pleading say, oh, but it can be spiritually or it can be desirous out of your control. And all of a sudden, yeah, that is a blameworthy factor. There's no basis on which to blame worthy blaming of somebody if it's ultimately a factor beyond their control. And that seems like a reasonable conclusion.
Well, there is. The basis to blame someone for anything is in the perfect commands of God, right? And that we ought to do, that we ought to give him glory. And when people don't, then they're blameworthy for those bad choices. What we're saying is that the ability there to meet the requirements of moral responsibility is not a categorical ability. It doesn't necessarily have to be some. And this isn't the only option here. Like I said, Feinberg posits a reasonableness option for his the ability. So I mean, just to have a problem with the conditional ability, it's not the only option out there available. I particularly myself, I do like the conditional ability, that the ability necessary to obtain moral responsibility is an ability that is conditioned upon whether or not we want to do it. Like if we want to do a thing, then yeah, sure. And we could have did otherwise if we had not wanted to do it. All of this meets the requirements for the necessity of moral responsibility. It's just better than simply assuming or begging the question that would be libertarian flavor.
We're just going in circles now because we're going back to their ability to want. And if you don't have any control over your wanter, as with the scientist with the brain node analogy illustrates, then it's superfluous to speak about whether you want to or not if the wants are not within your control. But with that said, I did, since this is on a discussion on the Unbelievable program, let me jump into the next section here where Chris answers the passage with regard to Jeremiah 7 and 32. It's in two places in Jeremiah where he says something to the effect of, that never entered my mind. He did not desire it. And here's that response.
My mind that they should do such a detestable thing and so cause Judah to sin. What's your response?
Yeah, so the Hebrew phrase here translated "enter into my mind" is used in several other places in the Old Testament, and it speaks of desire. In fact, the word translated "mind" is the Hebrew word "lev," meaning heart. So, for example, in 2 Kings 12:4, Jehoash uses the phrase to refer to the temple repair donation that any given man might desire to give, where the ESV translates it, "the money that a man's heart prompts him to bring." The Greek phrase used in the Septuagint to translate these passages is used by Stephen in Acts 7:23 to say that it came into Moses' heart to visit his brothers. So this objection to meticulous divine providence boils down to nothing more than the claim that God wouldn't predetermine what he does not desire or will in some sense. Because I totally agree, God does not desire to cause Judah to sin, for these people to sin. But theologians have long identified at least two senses in which we can speak of God's will. I write about this on page 108 of my book, distinguishing between God's revealed will on the one hand, God's declared will concerning what we should do or what God commands us to do, and his secret will on the other hand, his decreeing of events in the world. So Hebrews 6:1-3, for example, the author exhorts readers to leave the elementary doctrine of Christ and go on to maturity. And then he says, this we will do if God permits. So here we've got something God obviously desires, maturity, spiritual maturity, but apparently may not will to bring about. And there are examples like this all over the place. I'll just give a couple more examples. In Mark 4:11-12, Jesus says he speaks in parables so that those outside will not turn and be forgiven, even though earlier in Mark 1:15, he says, repent and believe in the gospel. In 1 Samuel 2:25, Eli's sons ignore his rebuke because it was the will of the Lord to put them to death, even though God takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, and on I could go. So I just don't see any reason for thinking that Jeremiah 32:35 supports Leighton's position over mine, or in any way challenges meticulous providence. I totally agree. God does not desire, in the sense of long for, want people to sin. But his sovereign plan, his decree from all eternity, I think, has purposes in mind for those things that he is nevertheless wants to bring about, despite his not desiring for it to take place.
A couple of minutes to respond, Leighton, and then we'll go to a break and we'll have a couple more passages from
Sure. I just honestly think that the explanation of the two wills of God from the Calvinistic perspective makes God out to be duplicitous. And again, I know that Chris doesn't believe God is duplicitous, but I think it makes him out to be, because you've got God externally saying, I want this thing, but secretly he's actually determining the exact opposite of that. Now, we agree there's different senses in which God wants things and brings things to pass, even within our worldview, but not in a way in which he contradicts himself or works against the very thing that he is outwardly saying he wants. I think that just gives a false view and makes us not being able to really trust what God says externally, because we have to wonder, well, is that what he wants internally as well? And I think that falls apart on itself. And he mentions if God permits. Well, in the same way I might say when I was a little kid, hey, I'll come over to your house if my parents will let me. Doesn't mean my parents are deterministically causing whether I'll go to my friend's house or not. It just means that I have to have God's permission, which, by the way, the word permission is the vernacular of Arminians and free will theologians, because what is God permitting if not the free agency of man? And even John Calvin recognizes that and says that permission was created as a vain refuge for the childish who aren't willing to give God full credit for his sovereignty. And lastly, he mentioned Mark 4, which we talk about quite regularly on our program.
Okay, and that's the portion I wanted to get to most directly, because, and I'm really glad that Chris brought up Mark 4, because that's one of the main passages with regard to the Messianic secret that we refer to as God's purpose in a sense, concealing his identity from the Jews of that day. And so that's one of the things I wanted to highlight, is how sometimes Calvinists refer to times in Scripture where God is bringing about a particular event, like the crucifixion, as somehow proof for omnideterminism. But again, as we pointed out in the first portion of our broadcast, proof that God works to bring about one particular event in human history that would even be considered evil does not in any way prove that God brings about all evil events, nor does it prove that God deterministically brings about the evil desires that were used within that given circumstance. For example, God doesn't have to make Judas a money-hungry backstabber in order for him to bring about the crucifixion of Jesus. God uses Judas's jealousy and his desire for money and his backstabbing, betrayous tendencies. He uses them to help to bring about an evil event, which is ultimately for the redemption of sin. And as I made the case in the broadcast, and feel free, guys, to comment on this, but the point that I was trying to make in the broadcast very clearly was that to refer to the crucifixion as your proof that God meticulously brings about all of the evil events is a self-defeating argument, because why would you point to the redemption, God's purpose in bringing about the redemption of sin, so as to prove that God brings about all the sin that he's redeeming? You've got then God determining the very sins that he's determining to redeem. And therefore God's just cleaning up his own mess. He's determining the sin, and then he's determining the redemption of that sin. And that again makes God not only the fireman that's putting out the fire, which you would obviously want to glorify and praise, but it also makes God the arsonist who sets the fire in the first place, making him much less praiseworthy than he would be otherwise. And so open up the room for the discussion on that one. I don't want to just diatribe over the same thing again, but I wanted to highlight that point, that there is a purpose in God hiding or concealing his identity, as the Messianic secret aspects that we talk about quite regularly on our program demonstrate, and like in a sting operation type of a situation, that don't require omnideterminism of especially men's pride and lust, which, by the way, Chris never answered this in the broadcast. He never replied to the 1 John 2:16 type passage. And of course, he's limited in time. I'll give him that. But that's the main argument, is that these things are not from God. These intentions, these desires, the thing that we're talking about with even Chris Harris here, is the origin of the desires, because ultimately within theistic determinism, the desire is ultimately determined by God, not by the agent themselves. And that's a problem, because the scriptures clearly and explicitly in didactic text teach that God is not the author of, is not the determiner of, is not the cause of these evil things. And that's a problem, I think, for the Calvinistic worldview. What say ye? Any of you, feel free to jump in. Go ahead, Jay.
Well, I was going to say that I liked your point about holiness, and that God is separate from sin, and that's a good place to start, and really frames the issue well. But I enjoyed listening to Chris. He really got me thinking, and it was really, really helpful. But taking Jesus and comparing it to Joseph and his brothers, there was a lot of evil going on, and God took that evil. Yeah, he arranged a lot of circumstances, and he brought a lot of things to pass. I have no problem with that. But he did not. He entered into an evil situation and brought about good. That's about the shortest way I can sum that up. He did not arrange for the Pharisees to desire to murder the Messiah. In fact, it doesn't surprise me at all that they would. When light and truth and goodness enters a dark world, it's not surprising at all that they might kill him. It's God worked the circumstances the way he wanted them to work to bring about redemption. But that doesn't mean he put the desire for murder in there. In the case of the brothers, they desired to murder Joseph. God put it in their hearts to sell them into slavery. He brought about good instead of death.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point too. I think it was James White that actually talked about how God somehow restrained them from murdering him. Of course, within the narrative, it's really decisions of first Reuben and then later Judah in the narrative, as far as why they ended up not murdering him and ended up selling him instead. But the point is if we would agree with James White that God had somehow restrained their evil, held them back, then what is he restraining if not the free will of the creature? Otherwise you've got God restraining that which he's determined. And that does not make, I don't think it makes any rational sense. And plus it ultimately, again, removes the blameworthiness of the creature and puts the blame back onto God, even if unintentionally. Chris, I see you unmuted your mic. Jump in.
Yeah, and I don't want to monopolize anything here, so it's your show. This is your thing. So if I talk too much, let me know.
Calvinist on board to represent the other side, so I don't mind giving you a little bit more time.
I got you. I understand. But yeah, no, I actually we would agree on this point, which is kind of strange. Maybe a while back, a few years ago, I wouldn't have so much, but yeah, men are evil by their own doing. But we would explain that through God's permissive will, right? And I know that you'll push back on what is God permitting if it's not his own determinations. Well, yeah, that's not just always the case. The problem we have with saying that God permits a thing is if we say that he just permits it like he doesn't want to, obtusely, as Calvin would put it. There's nothing wrong with God permitting a thing as long as it's not something that he's like, man, I shouldn't have let that. I hate this is going to happen, but I'm just going to permit it. So God's not working in the evil person to make the person evil. The person is evil of their own doing. And yes, he is using those evil intentions of the agent.
Okay.
That hit you strange?
Well, I mean, I obviously have problems with the compatibilism of it because, again, it goes back to the origin of the desire. And under compatibilism, at least compatibilism proper, is the way I've read it from the original sources, is that ultimately the nature controls what men will desire in their given circumstances, both of which are under God's meticulous providence, control, in other words. And so in those situations, it's God's deciding what you will decide, or God's deciding what you will desire to decide, even on compatibilism. And I don't see any way around that. I understand that people can continue to accuse me of equivocating and or using philosophy or blah blah blah, but I mean, even when I read even the best minds of this discussion saying the exact same things and accusations against the other best minds of the issue, then I'm just reminded that we can gaslight each other all day long or make each other feel stupid for calling the other view this or that. But until there's a reasonable explanation as to how this can be just not plain old hard determinism wrapped up in a little bit different verbiage, then I'm going to continue to bring the accusations that I think are needed for that. And again, Faber, Michael, you typed something in there. Go ahead and feel free to unmute your mic and make that point.
Well, yeah, he said that a person is evil of their own doing, but my understanding of Calvinism is we're evil because we are born evil, or we have a nature that makes us evil to begin with. So even the fact that we are evil is not of our own doing, and I think that plays right into what Leighton was just saying, was that our evil nature determines our desire. Well, our evil nature is not really of ourselves; it's of it's given to us at birth, and however that happens. So yeah, I mean, you can't. You're kind of going back and forth here and saying, well, man's evil because of what he does, but no, man's really evil because of his nature. You can't. It can't be both.
Well, I mean, I don't know how far we want to push it back. We could push it back. I mean, but there's at least some sense where everyone's going to have to admit. I guess if you're Orthodox anyway, your understanding of God's God and who He is, that everyone's going to admit that God's the author of evil, right? You may not like that term, but just simply by God creating, He actually did. If He did that by a free choice, which is what I believe He did. That there is that sense, but that doesn't mean that God is the author of evil and that He brings evil about. Does that mean? I mean, yes, He determines men to do evil things, but men do those evil things of their own genuine free will, and they come from their own evil desires, not given to them. They're not made evil by God.
Okay. Well, again, I'm just using the actual claims of Calvinists for themselves, and if someone is born in a condition where they can only reject God's appeals to be reconciled because of their nature, that's a factor beyond their control. I mean, you can decorate that however you want. You can continue to say, well, they're doing what they want. They're doing what they want. And I'm just going to keep saying, yeah, but what they want is determined by things that are not within their control, and therefore the level of blameworthiness is not real. On my view, those who reject God are so much more blameworthy because they're rejecting a God who actually loves them and has provided all that they need for salvation. And on Calvinism, they're rejecting a God who first rejected them and didn't provide the means they needed for their salvation. And so their blameworthiness is a lot lower on Calvinism than on my view. And the level of God's justice is much higher, because which is more just, a judge who condemns a person who couldn't have done otherwise, a person who was doing a crime because of factors beyond that agent's control, like a mental deficiency or some other thing that was causing them to desire or act in a way that they could not control. Is that more just for that judge to condemn that person to the electric chair than a judge who condemns somebody who acts in full malice and with the ability to refrain from doing that activity by factors within their control? Again, this is why I think Calvinism, though unintentionally, I think Calvinism actually reduces the blameworthiness of sinful men, and it also reduces the height of the justice of God and the glory of God by ultimately making Him the one blameworthy for the very sins that He ends up condemning men for.
Right, which I think I answered earlier, and I don't want to get back into that, but as far as the blameworthiness of God or the blameworthiness of man, because those are two very good questions those are two questions that have been brought up to Calvinists for as long as I know, forever. They're actually very old. They're found in Romans chapter 9, both of them, by the way. But what I was saying we can push it back far as you want. If you want to push our nature comes back from the eternal decree of God, and therefore God's responsible for that, then why, within your own view, wouldn't it be that you push it back to creation and God's free will choice to create as to why anyone does anything, and therefore saying that, hey, I didn't ask to be created, but you chose to create me, and I ended up this way.
Again, you talk about equivocation. We'll use that here. You can't equivocate between God's choice to create the existence of a free creature versus the choice of the creature to act in a free way. And so, though He may be the first cause of the existence of a free creature, He does not necessarily have to be the first cause of those creatures' choices. And so those are two different things. And to back up, I can't let the Romans 9 comment go without comment, Chris. Sorry.
I didn't think you could.
Good.
Yeah,
you know me better.
Yeah.
But obviously, the interlocutor in Romans 9, on our view, obviously is not answering that objection. He's the objector in Romans 9 is a Jew who's been hardened and calloused and given over like a criminal in a sting operation. At the end of it, once he's caught, he goes, "Oh man, you tricked me," and he gets all mad and angry. And why are you to blame me? You're the one who brought off this sting operation to pass. Well, that's the Jew. That's the hardened Jew in Romans 3 and again in Romans 9, who says, "Hey, if my unrighteousness brings about your glory, then why are you to blame me?" In other words, if my hardened rebellion crying out, crucify him, is what actually brings in the engrafting of the Gentiles, which was your plan all along, God, then why are you to blame me for something you determined that you brought to pass? That's the interlocutor. That's the answer that Paul is giving to that question. It has nothing to do with meticulous divine determinism of everybody's acts and deeds. And so I just have to point out that Romans 9 does not support the Calvinistic premise unless you assume a Calvinistic reading of meticulous divine providence or determination of all things into those texts, just so you know. But go ahead, Jay.
Well, sometimes the traditionalist gets a bad rap, and maybe it's our own fault sometimes because we're so concerned or worried about that word determinism. And when we need to embrace determinism, it's true. God determines things all day long. He decided that Adam and Eve would be male, one would be female. They would live in a garden. The only thing he didn't determine is whether they would sin or not, which is the point you were making. And it gets confused that, yes, God determines all kinds of things, but he's able to accomplish what he wants to do without violating people's freedom to make a moral choice.
Right. And that's the point I was hopefully trying to emphasize in the discussion I had with Chris on the Unbelievable broadcast, was to point out that proof that God determines some things doesn't prove that God determines all things. And even proof, even more specifically, that God determines an evil event to take place, like the crucifixion or the selling of Joseph, does not prove that all evil events are determined by God. And it most certainly doesn't prove that God determines the desires of the evil agents implicit within that evil action.
Exactly. And one example of that, bringing it back to Mark 4 and John 12 and Isaiah 6, is Jesus saying, eat my flesh and drink my blood, that sort of thing. Now, what I hear the Calvinists saying, well, God's just using certain means to accomplish an end. But for the non-Calvinists, what Jesus is doing is necessary, because he's not going to go in there and make the Pharisees want to kill him. He's not going to put a desire for murder in their heart. He has to work in such a way as they desire it on their own. That's why he speaks in parables. That's why he's hiding himself. And in Isaiah, God is telling Isaiah to go harden their hearts. And he doesn't do that through some magical work. He tells them to go preach the truth. And that will harden their hearts.
Right. And it's good compatibilism.
I was expecting you to say that, and I understand. But the point I wanted to make was what Jesus did was absolutely necessary. God was not going to go in there. Some people will take the verse in Proverbs saying God turns the king's heart whatever way he wants. Well, yes, but no. That's how he turns people's hearts. Jesus speaks the truth, and then for some people, he hides the truth.
Yeah, and that's what I was emphasizing earlier. And if you were listening to the broadcast earlier, I refer to Roger Olson's quote out of Chris Date's book, where he says, God may, and no doubt sometimes does, bring about some event by placing people in circumstances where he knows what they will do freely, libertarianly freely, because he needs them to do that for his plan to be fulfilled. That is what Chris just referred to as compatibilism. And if that's what compatibilism is, then hey, sign me up. But that's not what compatibilism is proper, according to the deterministic compatibilists that are the leading scholars of determinism. If you think that is what compatibilism is, then you don't understand philosophical compatibilism as the scholars teach it, because that's not what they're saying is happening in every given circumstance, because it's not just about what they're libertarianly freely doing. It's about God's ultimate control over the nature and the ultimately the desires of each individual, i.e. through acts of regenerating them or them being born in this quote unquote natural condition from birth, which of course is still well within God's sovereign control, in the compatibilistic / Calvinistic worldview. I see Jimmy joined us, and I wanted to give him an opportunity. Jimmy, not to put you on the spot, but feel free to unmute your mic and jump in. Or Chris, if you'd like to reply, go ahead.
Sure, yeah. I was listening a little bit before. I just wanted to bring up, it seemed like I also listened to the Unbelievable broadcast, and I wasn't sure if Chris's argument about foreknowledge in Acts chapter 4, Acts chapter 2, referring to Acts chapter 4, about it being sort of limited to, I don't know, whatever he would limit it to in that sense, but and the fact that, you know, it couldn't refer to God's simply, you know, taking in knowledge and, you know, foreknowledge in that sense. Well, that would almost seem to prove too much in his case, because predestination also, I mean, I would assume that Chris affirms, or Calvinists affirm in some sense, that God foreordains everything. And I think even like William Lane Craig affirms that. And so in some sense, I would disagree with Craig there, but it would seem to prove too much, because if God, you know, foreknows everything, which I would affirm, I don't think that's a problem for the biblical authors to state that in some sense, you know, in one instance, God foreknows a specific thing. That doesn't, you know, detract from the idea that God foreknows all things. So in the same sense, I would say that, you know, if they want to claim that God predestines all things, or foreordains all things at least, then I wouldn't, you know, then I think they would have a hard time maintaining that position, because the Bible also describes that God predestines some things. So I mean, I know I kind of jumped to a different topic, but just kind of want to bring that in.
Yeah, and I think the distinction between God's foreknowing of what free creatures, libertarianly free creatures, will do, and God's predetermination of a particular event carried out by free creatures also needs to be distinguished, which is what I was trying to distinguish with the police officer analogy and other things, is to try to help one understand that God, because he has foreknowledge of all things, and because he is able to work and make determinations of his own and interject within time and space to bring about a particular event that he wants to bring about, would be a better explanation as to the situations that he brought up with regard to Genesis 50 and other passages. It would make more sense in that case. And again, it would be a higher view of sovereignty, in my estimation, than what determinism allows for, because it's God foreknowing what independent free creatures will do versus God ultimately only foreknowing what he's determined to take place. And again, Calvinism proper does limit God's foreknowledge to what he determines, and only what he determines, which I think is a lower view of omniscience and foreknowledge personally, because it's ultimately God only knows it because he's determined it, which seems like a pretty small view, or a pretty low view of God personally. Go ahead, Chris.
Right. And I know some would put it this way, that we do ground God's knowledge in his decree. That's true, but we do it because we would say that God only knows true propositions. So it's not as though God knows something that won't happen next week. So, like next week, Leighton, you may wear a red shirt on Wednesday. That means that God doesn't know that you will wear a blue shirt on Wednesday, right? So, but anyway, so we would have to get into how you how you ground God's knowledge, and how he knows anything in that respect.
Yeah, and my point on using the same analogy of the red shirt, if I've used the figurine analogy. If I have a doll that I'm going to put a red shirt on next Wednesday, and I foretell you that my doll's going to wear a red shirt next Wednesday, I'll be right and go, okay, well, that's not impressive. There's nothing supernatural about that, because I'm determining what the doll's going to wear. And in the same way, if God's saying, hey, Leighton's he's going to pick a red shirt out and wear it next week, there's nothing impressive about that, because God's determining my circumstances and nature and desire such that I could only choose to wear a red shirt next week. So he's only foretelling what he's determined for his quote unquote doll, puppet, whatever you want to, analogy you want to do, to his morally accountable agent is going to do, because he's determined for his morally accountable agent do that thing through causative factors beyond his control. There's nothing impressive about that. Now, if God could tell me and predict with certainty, and tell me, hey, look, and I don't think the word prediction is probably a good word there, because I don't think for nations just prediction. I think it is certain knowledge, but it's certain knowledge in an eternal attribute, as an eternal attribute of God. And therefore, he knows Leighton will freely and autonomously, separate from God's determination, he knows what I will determine to do. That's supernatural and impressive. Just like if I could foretell what every shirt color you're going to all wear next week, who are watching this program right now, that would be a supernatural act. Whereas if I was determining what shirt you're going to wear next week, me foretelling it wouldn't be all that supernatural. It would just be like a computer programmer who's written a code telling you what he's coded for his avatars to wear next week. And there's nothing really special about that.
Right. And we would push back on that and say that if God knows that Leighton will wear a red shirt next Wednesday, then there's no possibility that Leighton won't wear a red shirt next Wednesday. That doesn't mean that we don't say that Leighton makes free choices in order to wear a red shirt next Wednesday. The problem would arise is if you say that God knows that you'll wear a red shirt next Wednesday, and then you still maintain the libertarian free choice as to whether or not you will wear a red shirt. Because under that, it would seem to be the case that even up until the point until you actually made that libertarian free choice, there's no way to know for God to know that you actually would. So I would ask you how you would ground the certainty of God's knowledge in that case.
Well, the certainty of his knowledge is in himself, as his eternal nature. Just like we know that he created something for nothing, we don't know how he did it. We know that he knows all things. We don't know how he gains all knowledge or knows all things. We just know that he does. But the way Calvinists have speculated is by saying, well, the way he knows it is because he determines everything. He scripted it, he authors it all, and that's how he knows it. And I just don't think that the Bible ever goes that far to say that. I think he knows it because he's God. That's part of his supernatural ability, is to know what free creatures will choose to do in the future. And if I'd choose a blue shirt instead of a red shirt, freely, libertarianly freely, that's what he would know, because he would know what I am freely choosing to do. And that's what makes it supernatural, is that I'm freely choosing to do it, but he knows it. And here's the key point, the philosophical issue that I've even been learning over this course of these last few years in studying these issues, is that though it's a sufficient condition to say that it's a principle of contra-causal choice, the ability to do otherwise, that's not the grounding principle. The grounding principle of a libertarian free choice is that it's made by factors within the agent's control. In other words, if it's self-determined, if in other words the determination is in and of oneself, and it's within the agent's control versus it being causally determined by outside of the agent's control, i.e. through sovereign decree, that is what makes a choice libertarianly free. And so that's the point I would really highlight as the difference between what really makes a choice morally accountable, is that it's made by factors that are within the agent's control.
Okay, so would you say that at the point of choice, that under the libertarian system, that a person would maintain the categorical ability to choose a red or blue shirt? Like they had the actual ability to do that at that point?
Yes, they would have the ability to choose, all available options from among all available options. God's certainty, that's the modal fallacy that's often referred to as the modal fallacy of certainty versus necessity. Because something's certainly known doesn't make it necessarily determined by the one who knows it. Knowledge is not causal. And so the argument is simply that, yes, you have the contra-causal ability to choose between the available shirts in your closet, or even to go out and buy a brand new shirt if you wanted to, or probably 1,000 other options, going shirtless or whatever else it may be, that are out there. All those are available possibilities that you're able to do. The fact that God certainly knows what you will choose to do does not remove the libertarian or the contra-causal aspects of that choice.
Sure, we wouldn't say it removes any of the freedom from the choice itself. And I wasn't positing some type of modal fallacy there. I was actually just asking for clarification and understanding how it is that God could actually know that the actuality of that libertarian free choice until that choice happens. I mean, he could have a good idea, I would think.
Yeah, but do you agree, Chris, that God on compatibilism determines the choice to wear a red shirt, if that's indeed what I end up wearing?
Sure, he determines it, but not in the sense that he programs us to. So it's not as though before the foundation of the world, God programmed you to wear a red shirt next Wednesday.
In what significant way would it be different than a program choice?
You would actually have genuine free will. So all of your choices that you make would be your own. They would be determined by you. It's just that God puts factors in front of you that move you to his divine decree. The means in which that his divine decree is worked out.
So the thing that I determined to do, to wear a red shirt, was first determined by God for me to determine that. So in other words, God is determining what I will determine.
Yes, that's primary and secondary causes. They're different causations, right?
So
God's is hyperphysical, ours is
is that
physical.
different than a programmer? Because if a programmer is programming an avatar, the avatar, under the speculation, desires to wear a red shirt. And so the reason he desires a red shirt is because the program has determined for the avatar to desire to wear a red shirt. So how is that in any significant way different than what you are positing God's doing with us?
Because we're actual sentient beings. We have reasoning factors, whereas a robot doesn't.
One thing good about suppositional arguments is I can now make the avatars sentient beings as well. So voila, they're sentient beings. Now what's the difference?
You give them a free will, then you created a human. I mean, I think that's what it is to be made in the imago Dei.
Positing within compatibilism is that God determines what they will determine. The programmer determines what the avatar will determine.
No, the programmer determines what the avatar will do, and the avatar can only do that. So that's fatalistic. The means that doesn't matter.
What I'm positing is that the avatar is actually deliberating. He sits and thinks about it. He has a feeling that he's real. The avatar has feelings and desires. Avatar has everything that you would say human beings have. But there's a computer programmer who is determined for that avatar to feel those things and to feel like he's freely making deliberations and choosing the red shirt. But it's actually the programmer who has determined what the avatar will end up deliberating and choosing to do. So how is that in any way significantly different?
It's significantly different in that a computer program is not analogous to a human being made in the imago Dei.
Well, that's
the big difference.
Okay, even though I'm saying it's exactly the same as what you're positing, and you're just saying no, it's not, because it's called an avatar instead of a human. I mean,
we know what computer programs are,
right?
So we'd have to have analogous, or we'd have to have similar features of the avatar and the human. So if you want to give the avatar all of the similar features of the human, that they have a will, that they're sentient, they have reasoning faculties, then you've just created another human being made in the image of God.
Right, but and that's exactly my point, is that if you put within the avatar all of the capacities, but you're still positing that the computer programmer programs, i.e. determines what the avatar will deliberate and choose, i.e. a shirt on Wednesday, then how is that different than what you're positing is actually happening within the Calvinistic worldview with us?
Because you no longer have a robot.
And
robots and humans aren't.
I'm trying to find a significant difference with a distinction between what an avatar that is a thinking, feels like he's self-realized, feel like he's making free determinations, but has actually been computer programmed to do what he does. I mean, how do you know you're not an avatar right now in the world of computer programmer God? I mean, maybe God programmed you to think that you're really a flesh and bone agent with real feelings and self-awareness, and who's to say that that's not exactly the way this world is working, is that God is just a big programmer in the sky determining what your next determination will be.
Right, the whole Matrix type situation.
Yeah.
It's a fun thing to think about, but I don't think it's pertinent to the discussion. What I'm saying is that we know what computer programs are, as much as people can make them seem to be to actual thinking as close as they are to AI. If they think that computer programs still aren't, they don't think for themselves. They still have to They have to. They don't have a will. They don't have a being. They're not made in the imago Dei. There's a huge difference between that and the human being.
Well,
But if you want to make it,
you use the language "think for themselves," but how can you say on one hand that God determines all things that come to pass, including every thought of man, because all those things do come to pass, and yet still say they're thinking on their own? Even the avatar's thinking is programmed a part of the computer program of the programmer, in the same way that, as Calvinists posit, even every thought, deliberation of man is ultimately something that which God has scripted within his divine decree.
right? But I think I denied that earlier, that those evil thoughts and desires aren't given by God. Right? It says all good things that come that we have or come down from heaven. So I'm not saying that God has programmed anyone with evil thoughts and desires. I've never posited that. Not in this discussion. I may have years ago when I was some type of cage stage Calvinist. But I no longer do. I don't see the necessity of it, even in a determined world.
Well, any of the other guys, we can kind of monopolizing back and forth here. Have another point you'd like to make before we close down our discussion this evening? I just realized it's already 8:00. It's gone by fast. Go ahead, Jimmy.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it seems like that Chris wasn't allowing the analogy, to hold water, and to me it just seems like that it does. I mean, I am a computer programmer, not to pull rank or anything, but it does make sense, in terms of to draw the analogy between. I mean, I don't think he was claiming that we're one-to-one analogous to a computer program, but I think Leighton was just trying to claim that that, like a computer program, God sets parameters that, I mean, even if you want to assume your system, that God sets certain parameters that we can't escape under your system. We will eventually all conform to God's decree in one way or another. Even if we're creaturely free in some sense. I don't think, like, from a free will perspective, from a libertarian perspective, I don't think that mankind is like metaphysically unpredictable to where God, if he were to give us freedom, cannot know what free creatures would do, similar to what Leighton was saying. And I don't think that God is limited in the sense of knowing contingent truths as well as truths, truths that will actually be displayed in the course of time. And so, in that sense, I mean, I think even some Calvinists, I don't know if you do, Chris, but some Calvinists affirm Molinism in that sense, like God's knowledge of contingent truths.
But yeah, no, I believe God knows counterfactuals, right? Like, he knows things that if X would occur, then this would have happened, right? I don't deny that. I do deny middle knowledge. I don't affirm that, but I do affirm that God can know the counterfactuals because they are truths. There's no you can't take the truth away from something. If this would have happened, then that would have happened. Like, if I take you to the top of a 100-foot cliff and I tell you if you jump you'll die, it doesn't matter if that ever happens or not. It still remains true. So yeah, that would still be a true proposition.
All right. Well, what I would like to do now is go ahead and shut things down. I was trying to limit myself to stop by 8:00, and so and that's longer than probably I even should go. But I wanted to thank all of those who jumped in and participated. Thanks for all those who tuned in to watch, and we'll see you next time. God bless. Bye-bye.